Good evening, everyone. I'm Sarannaya Bose, and I welcome you all to this panel discussion on cultural identity and ideology, curated under the Tell Me Your Story review in association with Center for South Asian Studies, University of Hawaii. Under this theme, TMYS Review March 2023, we'll talk about language and provincial narratives. The topic for today is portrayal of hybridity and otherness in Indian mythology. We are honored to have Dr. Jeffery D. Long and Anuja Chandramouli ma'am as our esteemed speakers for the panel. Thank you for joining us. I shall now quickly introduce our speakers. Dr. Jeffery D. Long is a professor of religion and philosophy and Asian studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, where he has taught since receiving his doctoral degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. He has authored many articles and several books, including Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds, Jainism, An Introduction, and with Michael Long, Nonviolence in the World's Religions, A Concise Introduction. Anuja Chandramouli ma'am is a best-selling author and New Age Indian classicist widely regarded as one of the finest writers in mythology, historical fiction, and fantasy. Her debut novel, Arjuna, Saga of a Pandava Warrior Prince, was highly acclaimed and was named as one of the top 5 sellers in the Indian writing category for the year 2012 by Amazon India. Her articles, short stories, and books appear in various publications like the New Indian Express, The Hindu, Scroll.in, and Femina. She is also an accomplished TEDx speaker and a storyteller. Now, I'd like to start today's session. Anuja Chandramouli ma'am, I would request you to please present your views on today's topic. We are joined by Dr. Lavanya Vemsani ma'am. Welcome ma'am to the panel. I'd like to Namaste. I'd like to quickly introduce Dr. Vemsani. Dr. Lavanya Vemsani is a multi-award winning scholar and distinguished university professor of history at Shawnee State University in the Department of Social Sciences and visiting professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, in the Department of Historical Studies. She researches and publishes on subjects of ancient history and religions as well as current history of India. She is editor-in-chief of International Journal of Indic Religions. Professor Vemsani has served as the president of Ohio Academy of History from 2018 to 2021. So without further ado, I'd like to start today's session. Anuja Chandramouli ma'am, I request you to please present your views on today's topic.
Thanks, Sarannaya, for the intro. Hello to everyone. Such a privilege to be on this panel with Dr. Jeffery and Professor Lavanya. And I love the topic we're discussing today, hybridity and otherness in Indian mythology. I think it's such a rich topic for discussion and something that really fascinates me. It's not a secret. I've always loved, I adore mythology, whether it's Indian, Greek, Egyptian, whatever it is, because I feel Indian mythology, we'll stick to Indian mythology today. I feel it's like a living organism that it's just something that keeps growing and evolving with time. I think that's beautiful. That's the beautiful aspect of it, because India has always had this rich oral tradition of storytelling, and we keep adding to the stories with every generation. We share the stories we've heard with future generations, and everyone keeps adding. So, I love that Indian mythology assimilates the changing attitudes, the changing ideologies, as time goes by. I think that's one of the beautiful things, which is why I find Indian mythology to be extremely representative. It's always ahead of its time in a way. So one of my favorite stories from Indian mythology is about Shikandi. Shikandi is this really fascinating character in the Mahabharata. originally born as Amba, a princess. Shikandi uses his rage, his anger. Basically, he weaponizes his trauma to exact revenge on Bhishma, one of the pillars of the Mahabharata. And I think that's one way of exploring the fact that sexuality itself is constant. It's a fluid thing. It's not quite how we view it today. It's a hugely controversial topic today to talk about biological sex and gender affirmative politics. It's a controversial topic, but I think it's nice to discuss this through stories, because that way you don't give offense and you also learn a lot about how, even if we are uncomfortable with certain things, we can probably explore these issues through the power of stories, and we can also bring about change one story at a time. So Shikandi is this character where, this sexuality of this character is the biological sex, which later changes. This character who's born a female does a lot of things to evolve and to embrace the masculine side, I would say. So that's one character which is very interesting for me in the Mahabharata. Another example, I've also written a book on Ganga. And one of the fascinating aspects about that particular character, everyone, lots of people who love Indian mythology will know about the role played by Bhagirath in bringing Ganga to earth from her heavenly abode. And but not many people know that Bhagiratha's birth took place under very mysterious circumstances. His father died before he could impregnate either of his wives, because he was committed to performing penances to redeem redeem and resurrect his ancestors. So he passed away before he could bring forth heirs, and the gods decreed that it was the will of destiny that a child be born in this line, because this child was going to be special. This child was the one who would be responsible and successful in bringing Ganga to earth. And so Bhagiratha's mothers brought forth this child. So Bhaga refers to the vulva. So again, we are talking about a lesbian union and how it's possible, to bring forth children even through unconventional unions. So it's fascinating that Indian mythology has addressed these issues long before it became the woke thing to do. Today, we are always asking everyone to speak up and to share their truth. But this was something that is there in whether you're studying the Padma Purana or any of the Puranas. Actually, if you deep dive into Indian mythology, these are the fascinating elements that pop up at regular intervals, which allow us, we all have our biases, we have certain prejudices. If you're being completely honest, there are lots of things about people we view as different from us, the othering of others which we do, which of course leads to intolerance, to hatred, but it need not be that way. It just means that you need to just open yourself up to exploring things which seem strange to you. You just have to be willing to listen, to understand how it is for different people. So Indian mythology, in my opinion, has always been a very, very wonderful way to address these issues without making it without making it too hate-filled, I would say, without making it too controversial in a lot of ways. And when I started research for my book on Mohini, just a little something about Mohini. Mohini is is the feminine avatar of Vishnu, and I would say that she was definitely his most potent avatar, because she was present in multiple timelines, and which meant that Vishnu felt the need to return to this persona of his repeatedly. Usually, his avatars fulfill the purpose for which they were born, and that was that. With barring a few exceptions here and there. Mohini, on the other hand, seems to be, his preferred avatar for getting himself and the humans he was entasked with protecting out of tricky situations. So Mohini is this fascinating, lovely character, and again, she is something of an icon a gender sexual icon because she did not subscribe to prescribed gender roles. So Mohini, and she was definitely not merely an enchantress who batted her eyelashes and used her beauty to get her way. She was this very, very fascinating character who prevailed when, might wasn't going to carry the day, when traditional warfare wasn't going to do it. So Mohini was about what women bring to the table, about how there is not always just one solution to any problem. So Mohini again is a very, very fascinating character, and there are a lot of unconventional sexual relationships which Mohini has, even whether it's with Shiva and her other lovers. So this was again unconventional aspects of the sexual dynamics which we wrestle with to this day, which were covered. So it's really lovely that you can learn so much through Indian mythology. But one of the problematic misconceptions, there's so much misinterpretation of Indian mythology, which has led to a lot of issues in present day India, where we are finding it increasingly difficult to have civilized conversations about the things which bother us. And I'll just put it out there. I think caste is one such thing, which is always hugely problematic in today's world, when it's reached a point where we can't talk about it like rational human beings without getting into a yelling match. And I find that a lot of people use Indian mythology to bolster some extremely problematic views on caste and issues like untouchability. So I felt it's necessary to share one of, again, a story which made a huge impression on me. It's about sage Uttama, again a hugely beloved yet controversial character in Indian mythology. So Uttanka has won a boon from Krishna, and Krishna would have revealed his Vishwarupam to him. And Krishna also offered, Krishna asked me for anything at all, I will grant it to you. And he says, okay, I'm going to spend a lot of time performing penances in the desert. I would just like water to be readily available for me, just that. So Krishna agrees to this, and Uttanka went to the desert with a full heart. He's performing his penances. He's thirsty as hell, and he thinks of Krishna, but Krishna doesn't appear in front of him. There's no sign of water anywhere, so he's just getting a little bugged. He's like, okay, I got a boon. What's happening out here? And suddenly this Chandala appears before him. Chandalas are considered to belong to the untouchable caste. So this Chandala, who's not exactly well groomed, he's looking a little. He's covered in dirt. He's appearing with a couple of stray dogs, which definitely look rabid, and he's holding this very dirty dish in his hand. And he tells Uttanka, "You seem to be very thirsty. Why don't you have a drink?" And Uttanka is horrified. He's repulsed. He's thinking, how can I accept water from a Chandala? And he says, he thinks of Krishna in anger, and he says, how could you do this to me, Krishna? Gently, Krishna appears before him and says, I really thought you were at an evolved, enlightened place where you would see a gift when it appears right in front of you. That was Indra. It was a test. I felt you deserved the nectar of immortality. I felt you'll be wise enough to see it in whichever form it was offered to you. But you didn't. And therefore, I will quench your thirst, yes, but you could have had so much more. I think it's a beautiful, gentle way of conveying that it's not okay to treat anybody at all like that, especially when someone's being kind and offering you water. I think Indian mythology, Hinduism itself is about being representative. It's about making room for everybody in society. That's the beautiful thing about Indian mythology and Hinduism as a way of life. So when it's weaponized, when it's used to propagate ideas of hate, I find it hugely problematic. And I think those of us who love Indian mythology, we should make sure that we share the stories and the interpretations in a way that carries on the original traditions of this Vedic religion, where you seek to deal with your shortcomings. We acknowledge that we are all flawed, including the gods. We were talking about Indra before the session began. So we really do address the darkness in human nature through Indian mythology. We are all human, we all have our foibles, but we can always aspire to be better than how we are right now. We need to learn that it's nice to be nice, that kindness and compassion always matters more than brute strength, more than power, more than wealth. This is what will redeem us as humans. It's a beautiful thing and it cannot be stressed enough. And that's what I wanted to say. So I'm so grateful for this platform that was offered to me. And I'm looking forward to hearing the thoughts of Dr. Jeffrey and Professor Lavanya as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I think what you mentioned about traditional Hindu culture being very open and inclusive of different genders, I think it was this new age or new telling of Hinduism brought in by the colonizers that has kind of altered the way we talk about what Hinduism is about or what we should and should not do. So yeah, I really cannot wait to hear from the other speakers. So I'll quickly move on to Dr. Jeffrey D. Long. Sir, please.
Thank you very much, and namaste, namaskar. Thank you for having me here today. And I really enjoyed Anuja's presentation, and I was planning to talk about Shikandi, and then she talked about Shikandi, and then I thought, well, okay, then I'll talk about Mohini, and then she talked about Mohini. So I want to turn to another figure on whom I've reflected a great deal, and I think it is a very profound significance on multiple levels, and that is, of course, Ardhanarishwara, the form of Shiva and Shakti together as one being, depicted often as half male, half female. And this figure, I think, has a lot to tell us today in the contemporary world, and really at all times in history. And when I say us, I mean people in the Hindu tradition, people in India, but then also people globally, and including, I think, in the Western world. When we look at this figure, this beautiful Ardhanarishwara, there are many wonderful representations of this image. For those who aren't familiar with it, Ardhanarishwara means the Lord who is half female, right? Is half male, half female, and is depicted usually as one half of the body being half of the body of Lord Shiva, and the other half of the body being half of the mother goddess Parvati, or Shakti, as she is also known. Of course, all the goddesses are Shaktis, right? They are the power behind the gods, and often leading the gods, in fact, as in the story of Ma Durga. But in the Ardhanarishwara, what we see is the idea that what we all are, all living beings at the highest level, at the spiritual level, is not limited to things like gender. And then I think we can extend that in our modern world even to things like ethnicity. The refrain we hear again and again in the ancient texts is, we are not this body. Right? This body is where we get notions of ethnicity, nationality, caste, gender. All of these things are tied to the form in which we are currently manifested. But that is only our current manifestation. We have had other lives before this, other manifestations. There'll be other lives, other manifestations to come. And so this image shows us that at the highest level, that the Paramatman, the supreme self that is in all of us, encompasses the elements that we think of in our conventional societies as male and female. And of course, in both India and the West, we have a lot of stereotyped notions about what is male and what is female, so that maleness comes to be identified with strength, with courage, with certain energy to get up and get things done, a certain aggression, not necessarily in a negative sense, but just aggression in the sense of the willpower to move forward in life. And yet, so many women embody these qualities. If I can be a tiny bit personal for a moment, I was raised mainly by women. My father died when I was quite young, and I grew up with my mother and my grandmother. And they're two of the strongest people I have ever met. And I have continued to meet strong women throughout my life. The traditionally feminine characteristics, the stereotypically feminine characteristics, we think of compassion, we think of nurturing, we think of gentleness. But men are capable of being compassionate and nurturing and gentle, right? So, what is behind these stereotypes? Well, what we're seeing is that these are all positive qualities of the soul, that the Atman, that the potential we all have within us, carries with it courage and power and strength. And it also carries within it compassion and love and gentleness and benevolence. And in if we try to imagine an ideal personality, it would be one that would encompass all of these. It would be, if you think of who is the person you would most like to be with, or who is the person you would most like to be yourself, I think it would be someone who is both strong and kind, someone who is both powerful and compassionate, someone who encompasses all of these qualities that our societies tend to ascribe to one gender or another. And the Ardhanarishwara beautifully depicts this, that you have here one being that is containing the qualities of both of these genders that we see. And it's a really a brilliant, a really insightful way of depicting this concept, because it's visual, right? You don't even have to know how to read and write or have to have studied philosophy to see that this is a deity. This is the supreme being. And the supreme being is both male and female, is not limited to just one or the other form. And of course, we see this throughout the story literature as well. Uh, Anuja talked about Mohini, for example, who is a form of Lord Vishnu. We think of Vishnu as male. We use male epithets, but Mohini is also a form of Vishnu, and a very important one, right? Who comes to save the world at very key times and moments. And so there too, we have the idea that God is not limited to just one quality in terms of male and female. Of course, in India, we have the ancient idea developed in the Sankhya and Yoga traditions of the Purusha and Prakriti, right? That these are the essential elements that make up existence. That Prakriti is the material nature. All of the phenomena that we experience are manifestations of that Prakriti, but the consciousness which shines through it all is the Purusha. And these are also gendered concepts. Purusha is a masculine term. It's often used to translate man, though it's cognate with our English word person, if you think of it. So really, Purusha is also an encompassing concept. But in terms of Sanskrit grammar, it's a masculine noun. Prakriti is, of course, feminine. And this idea has been picked up in the Shaiva and Shakta traditions. And we see Lord Shiva manifesting or being a representative of the Purusha principle. And the various forms of Shakti, Parvati, Durga, Kali, they are all various manifestations of Prakriti, the material nature, the matrix really from which all things come. And so these very powerful philosophical concepts have been beautifully illustrated in these stories and these images. And that brings me to the next thing I wanted to mention today, which is this term mythology. And we've been already talking about some controversies and how polarized the contemporary world often is. If you say one thing, you have a whole group of people attacking you, and if you try to say, well, no, that's not exactly what I meant, then you get another whole group of people attacking you. And it's difficult to even manage on social media, right, sometimes, because people get so antagonistic about things. So what's that have to do with these stories? Well, one of the things that gets contested a lot, one of the things that there are people who will automatically become ready to fight is when they hear this word mythology. Because if we say in our conventional speech that such and such is a myth, right, that means it's not true. right? That means, okay, it's not a fact, it's a myth, right? And we have this very simplistic binary in our minds of fact and myth. But if you look at the really serious work of, if you think of scholars like Joseph Campbell, for example, who was very deeply drawn to Vedanta and to Hindu ideas, and a lot of other people who've worked in this field since that time. He's just the most famous one. Um, what is perceived is that these stories actually contain very profound truths. To say something is mythology is not to say, well, it's false and therefore we don't have to pay any attention to it, right? These are children's stories or something that can be dismissed. What it means is that there are truths that are so profound that they're very difficult to communicate in a simple, straightforward, logical, X equals Y sort of pattern. That they're better communicated through images, through narratives, and these have an emotional impact on us, and they leave an impression on us that's much deeper than if something is simply stated. So these stories, I think we have to redefine mythology as not as something that's false, but as something that is often so true that it breaks the bounds of language that is conventional speech. It requires an image like Ardhanarishwara, like a story like the story of Shikandi or the story of Mohini. It requires this almost in order to communicate itself, right? These deep truths. So I think this is an important thing to understand, that a lot of the Hindu stories, I think you could almost see as a kind of code for very deep truths of the human condition, psychology, nature of mind, nature of consciousness, and the nature of gender and our relationship to the body and to the physical world. And it's all being narrated through stories because that's the only way we can really do it. My favorite Western philosopher, modern Western philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, he uses this phrase about our language becomes a set of mute metaphors waiting for an imaginative leap. And I think myth takes that imaginative leap. It says, well, let's tell a story, right? Just like this program, right? Tell me your story. And the story often is able to convey far more than a simple, straightforward account would do. I can say the divine reality encompasses male and female, and students will write it down very faithfully and take their notes. Okay, very good. But then you see the image, and it completely changes the way you think. Right? That you have encountered that now, rather than simply heard an idea and thought about it. So I think this is very important. And just in the 1 or 2 minutes I have remaining, and Anuja discussed this as well. There's so much conversation about gender today, and this is happening in the Western world. It's also happening in India. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to be found in these ancient stories. And I think when we look at the world of ancient India and we look at the thought world of the Hindu tradition, it is too vast to be encompassed by our contemporary simplistic binaries of conservative and progressive, right? That it contains both of those elements as well in various ways and with a different dynamic. And I think that can really, again, shed light on our contemporary polarized discussions. Everything's been reduced to two options. You're on this side or you're on that side. The thought world of ancient India was so much more multifaceted. And in the Jain tradition, which I also study, you hear this expression where there are two sides to every argument. And people who say that think they're being very open-minded. But according to the Jain tradition, there's 7 sides to every argument. So there's much more than can be encompassed in our polarized discussion. And that's why these stories are so important. They invite us to step out of that, I think. So I would now like to defer to and hear Professor Vemsani, who I've heard spoke many times before, and look forward to hearing from her again.
Thank you so much, sir. I think the thing that you mentioned about these images, these profound truths being presented to a set of people, to a larger society, not through factual arguments, but through images and the storytelling. So I think this tradition of storytelling or orality is very important in most of Oriental cultures, because it's and the thing about orality, what I strongly believe is, when we pass on a, a story to somebody, like I tell you a story and then you tell that story to somebody else, so I think there's a lot of addition and what you believe in the society, so in that very story, and I think everybody's perspective is equally important since they are part of one big culture. So I think this is how, I mean, the universality or even inclusion of different individuals living in the same society can maintain. So oralities are like, I mean the Western world would always like to differ, that they don't consider anything that is not written to be real knowledge. Something that we have also seen in many, I mean, as a kind of a tool against Western imperialism in
Yes.
many African writers, Indian writers, that they continue this form of storytelling and orality. So that was very interesting to hear from you. So lastly, I'd like Professor Lavanya Vemsani to please present.
Okay.
Ma'am, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am really honored to be on this panel, and I heard both Miss Anuja and Professor Lang. Both of them have given us good examples, good theoretical perspectives, and covered almost the whole idea of othering and the issue with it. So now, instead of focusing on any gender or anything, I will just focus on fluidity, and I'll focus on theoretical perspectives. The 2 points that I will talk about today. The first point I'll talk about is the concept of fluidity in association with any identities, and the second thing I would like to talk about it is colonial perspectives, the colonized mind. The colonized mind actually misses the actual meaning of understanding many of these things. I appreciate Professor Lang mentioning about the usage of this word myth. The using the term myth in connection with these Indian stories, Indian classical literature, actually limits the role of literature that in India. So, with that, I will go ahead speak about the true understanding of identity in India in classical texts, and secondly, the colonized mind. So, what do we think? What do we think of self? What do we think of a person? What do we think of a person in this world as the other world? What is our understanding? What is Hindu understanding of a self? So, self is seen as uh, uh, a, a, a term that encompasses and is beyond any identity. Maybe it is gender, ethnicity, or race, or religion. So the soul is this pure representation of the divine within a person. The pure divine, of course, Brahma, is at the same time the universal self is also without any gender, any identity, anything that we can really think of. It's no color, no identity, no this thing. So when we see, as my panelists have mentioned, when we see Ardhanarishwara, it's a representation of this Brahma, and the Brahmanda that we also come across in the story of the origin of the world, in the story of Vishnu, is non-gendered. Agendered. So there is no gender to the term self, to the term Brahma, and to the Brahmanda. So the anda from which the universe has originated. Um, so as we understand it, the stories tell us there is identity all around us. There is identity based on gender, based on race, based on ethnicity, based on our lifestyles. The lifestyle is also accepted as an identity. The lifestyle we might adapt also gives us an identity, the profession or the styles we adapt. So all these might give us some kind of an identity, but that should not ruin our understanding, our concept of the self, which is agendered. It's male, female, and a complete gender. It's beyond the narrow identity of a gender. What happens is our understanding is reflected in the fluidity. The fluidity that is understood in the form of self is actually noted in the Mahabharata when the stories of the Vanavasa is discussed. Arjuna and Bhima, both of them. Arjuna, of course, is cursed to live as a woman for a year. Of course, he under this curse, but Bhima, of course, dresses as a woman when there was the issue of Draupadi being attacked. He dresses as a woman to go and vanquish that person. But so this gives us an idea of how the gender fluidity, the persons who are accepted as male, really seen as male, under certain circumstances also assume the form of female. And this happens in the case of Mohini, as we spoke previously. So the gender, of course, completely male, but under special circumstances, the female can be embraced, because a person is made up of this soul, which is a comprehensive form of the male, or assuming a male form or expression of a male or expression of a female, not ruin, should not affect the identity of the soul as it is. This, because the soul is the matter, body is not the important thing. The soul is the important part. Uh, so we see this gender fluidity, fluidity of identity, because five Pandavas also go and live under pseudonyms, and these pseudonyms reflect how the princes of the kingdom have lived a common life later on, and who were not known to anybody. So the identity, maybe it is gender, maybe it is race or status or lifestyle, is seen as fluid. Circumstances, the Kala Dharma determines what happens to identity. So we are urged. Hindus are always urged to look beyond the identity of a person, to regard a person beyond the identity that it appears, because the identity might change. It's not a permanent identity. It can change in many circumstances. And we already talked about Amba, who becomes Shikandi and who uses weaponizes her inner urge, inner fire to accomplish what she wishes. So this idea of gender fluidity, this idea of looking beyond any narrow identities, is central to Hinduism. And I have known to have said, India hasn't discovered itself, so it doesn't know what its self is. So it cannot really understand the other is. So current circumstances really limit us in our understanding. This brings us to the second part of our discussion, the colonized understanding. So what we call here the lost in translation. Lost in translation is most of the times used as a joke, but this is true in the case of India. The Indian literature is translated, but most of the time the real meaning is missing from understanding because of these haphazard translations. The true meaning of India are lost. So I would uh, I would take Rabindranath Tagore here. Rabindranath Tagore has encapsulated this in his work, Gora, how Indian self, Indian understanding is like a caged bird. It's like a caged bird. The self, the understanding, the mind, in a it cannot really understand what is going on around itself. So, so why aren't these stories told to us? Why aren't these flexible stories recollected in works on India and Hinduism? Why don't we know about Uttanka? Why don't we know about Shankara's story, where he actually meets a Chandala, Mahadeva as Chandala, and then realizes identities are limited? And why don't we hear about Sri Vaishnavism, which doesn't regard caste, which has actually incorporated everyone among them, as training them as priests and teaching them Sanskrit? Why do we repeatedly said that Chandalas are not allowed, Chandalas are not taught Sanskrit? But there are examples here. Shankara has done it, Ramanuja has done it, and Sri Vaishnavism and many others have disregarded caste, because caste is something that is a artificial and temporary identity. It's not a complete identity. So the issue with us, the issue currently we are facing with the self and the other, is that uh, it's not that it's not there. We have it in our text. We have an understanding of it, but it hasn't come out. It hasn't been brought out in examinations and academic studies. It has been lost in translation, as some say. So it's important to rediscover. It's important to understand. It's important to bring all these information and stories to the front, so that we bring out a true understanding of our limited nature of the society that we have up to this point. Um, with that, I will stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think if we kind of sum up all three of you, the things that all three of you, it's a very succinct discussion. So I really like to start with the question and answer session because I have a lot of things in my mind. So I'd go over to you, Dr. Vemsani. My question to you is, um, do you feel that the concept of transsexualism in Hinduism is often overlooked or misinterpreted? And I mean, we have talked about, or we have seen that traditional Hindu culture said one thing about transgenders and women, and then we see there's a lot of there's a lot of hate, there's a lot of controversy about what is supposed about, there's a lot of normative tradition about what is to be done. So my question to you is how, amidst all of this, does the modern Hindu or modern Hinduism combat this?
Um, right. Um, there are 2 points here. It's a good question. 2 points here. The first point is what about our texts, what they tell us, right? That's the truth. What the texts tell us, that's the truth about our practice and our identity and ourself. But what about practice? The practice, of course, is changed through colonization for a long time. That's where the colonized mind actually plays out. And I have already emphasized about the lost in translation aspect. The lost in translation aspect is very important to note here, because India, of course, colonized for a long time. Some people might not agree, but India has been colonized from 13th century onwards. Colonization is not just literal colonization, but colonization of the mind through imposing foreign language, through imposing foreign culture, through imposing foreign legal code. So that's what happened in India. Persian legal code, Persian language was imposed on India from 13th century onwards. Even if it is a short rule of a sultan. Nizam rule was very short-lived in Hyderabad state, but Persian legal code, Persian language was, of course, in practice. So if you think about that, what happens to a culture when there is no system to actually represent what is theirs? So, what is Hindu tradition, Hindu culture, Hindu understanding of self is not represented and is not talked about, not understood in the public. What happens if this is done for a long time? So, this is done from 13th century onwards, and then the last nail is by the British. The British not only stopped it from being represented, they interpreted it in a narrow and colonialist way. So it was already stopped from being represented. It's already from being in public mind, in public discussion and public practice. So they were all going narrow and practicing these narrow things, and then learning about the narrow cultural identities. Of course, you know how Parda is followed by many Hindus, even to this day. But Parda is an alien concept to Hinduism. So that's only an outside representation, but this is also happening inward in the mind and in the understanding of the people. They have forgotten what their original understanding was. They have forgotten what they thought was, what their text told them. So they are practicing these narrow identities, narrow practices that were imposed on them, given to them. And then finally, there is another colonial regime that tells them everything that you are doing is wrong. Everything you have here is backward. So already they have forgotten what was there. And then there is this new knowledge that was created, which is not even representative, which actually brings forward ideas that are not really part of original thought. And many of the stories were misinterpreted. If they bring anything forward, they actually misinterpret. Otherwise, they ignore. So by ignoring many of the original concepts and stories, and by misinterpreting many of these concepts, a new kind of Hinduism is brought to people. It was taught in India, it was taught everywhere else. So I have already talked about this also, because it is based on this wrong knowledge, wrongly created understanding, mistranslation of Hinduism. The colonial understanding of Hinduism actually contributes to Hindu phobia because it doesn't give a true representation to Hinduism. The true representation of Hinduism is actually missing from the modern understanding of Hinduism. And an example is the interpretation of these classical texts and classical stories as race stories. The Aryans coming in and then occupying, and then, you know, the demons that are represented in these stories. You know, Rama is this Aryan prince, and then Ravana is this great representative of the, you know, the native Dravid. So where is these natives? Where are these Aryans? Why didn't they tell us? Of course, they are in this created myth, but why don't I find them when I go to see these excavations? There are almost 5,000 prehistoric sites excavated in India. There is continuity from 40,000 years ago, 80,000 years ago. You know, in Tamil Nadu, Atirampakam, they actually excavated a site which has continuity from 192,000 years ago. So this is continuous evolution, continuous language, continuous culture. Where are these Aryans who came? Why don't we see them in archaeological excavations? And why don't they tell us? If they came and murdered somebody, they should be so proud and they should tell us, right? Oh, yeah, we occupied and we oppressed these people and we gave them the civilization, you know. Why didn't they tell us? So who are these Aryans that we didn't know for a long time? Our culture was there for, if even if you give it a short span, our texts date from 5,000 years ago. So so 5,000 years ago they didn't tell us. So what happened? They came, so you were telling us this story, but what was the original story? So our understanding of ourselves is completely lost. So what you see in practice now, the narrow identities and the narrow practices, is not original to Hinduism. So if you look at Hinduism before 10th century, and then after that in small pockets like Sri Vaishnavism and other smaller groups, still continued this practice of original Hinduism that is derived from the Vedas and classical texts. But most often it was lost because of this colonized practices that were imposed on India. So thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I believe popular culture and even films. I mean, very recently there has been a lot of I mean there's a trend of actually producing films which talk about Indian mythology. And when you, I mean, forget the film. If you just watch the trailer, I mean,
Yeah.
it is
So
it is horrendous.
misrepresentation still continues, right?
Still
It was
continues, and along with modern, I mean, rich technology, but really poor VFX, really poor storytelling. There is no actual content, and everything they have absolutely, you know, the entire thing is like topsy turvy. There's no, I mean, there's just heroism, and it's just one sided. It's what one. I mean, I think Ramayana. I think there are multiple versions, multiple versions of Ramayana.
when you say
Uh,
versions, you have to be careful. There is only one version of Ramayana. Valmiki Ramayana is the original Ramayana. Other Ramayanas are Jain Ramayanas, folk Ramayanas. These are all adaptations. We can't call them as Ramayana in the same breath with the original Ramayana of Valmiki. The original Ramayana is original Ramayana of Valmiki. Everything else is adaptation or translation or some kind of interpretation.
okay. So since Dr. Vemsani mentioned about these representation and portrayal in modern times, my next question is to Dr. Long. And this is in connection with not only the Hindu heroes or the male figures, but this is also in relation to the representation and portrayal of the transgender community in art and film. So, do you think that the representation and portrayal of the transgender community in art and film has suffered in modern times? And how do you see this portrayal as against representation in ancient India? What are we doing wrong?
Right. So, of course, there are many different portrayals, but I mean, you're talking about, kind of dominant trends. And I think these unfortunately tend to often be very stereotyped and superficial. And there's not a lot of in-depth exploration of the characters who manifest and represent these identities. And I think this is very different from what we find in the ancient stories. And the story of Shikandi, there's so much psychology there. There's so much reflection there on the nature of self, nature of identity. And again, it's this in-depth understanding of self that includes and encompasses body and gender, but also goes much beyond that, right? And I recently had the good fortune of I was collaborating with a friend of mine who's an artist who is a Indian classical dancer in the Bharatanatyam tradition, but she also develops new plays and new representations of these ancient stories. And we collaborated on a piece that she's putting together on Shikandi. And there is so much depth in these stories. The superficiality of the contemporary representations, I think, is a big part of what is problematic. And I would pick up on what Professor Vemsani has said also, that in terms of the values that are often projected or presupposed beneath the surface of these representations, they really have very little to do with the ancient Indian traditions, and it's much more of these things that have been brought in through colonization. And a lot of the Western hang-ups and issues and concerns are now being played out in India, and you see that in the film and so on. And it's sad because the West itself is beginning to try to go beyond all of this, and to with great difficulty, but it's trying to shrug off a lot of these superficial conceptions. But India, I mean, because of the process that Professor Vemsani described, has absorbed a lot of this quite uncritically. And so I don't want to sound too grim. I think there are artists who are really trying to think beyond all of that. But that is the dominant trend, I think.
Right. Okay. So since we have we don't have much time left, I'll quickly move over to Anuja Chandramouli ma'am, and this is something in relation to women in mythology. We have talked about male figures. We have talked about the third gender. So, ma'am, based on your recent book, Mohini, the Enchantress, um, I mean, you have talked about her. I mean, this is a very lesser known figure. So, do you think that a female sexuality is represented in Hindu mythology through the figures of Mohini and Menaka? So, and how are these women how are these women different from the other female characters like Draupadi or Ahalya or even Shakuntala? Do you believe that, or do you think that the characters of Mohini and Menaka, they reflect, or I mean, when the what did the writers have in mind when writing about Mohini and Menaka? Do they reflect a woman's charm and sexual prowess negatively?
That's a very, very interesting question because I think we are these women, these powerful women, come in very different categories. When you're talking about Draupadi or Sita from the Ramayana, they were wives. They belong to a very conventional part of society. When you're talking about Menaka, they were Menaka. Mohini wasn't one of the Apsaras, but she wasn't exactly a wife either. So, we are talking about in mythology, they talk about the Apsaras as very empowered women who have embraced their sexuality. They are referred to as currency, which changes hands a lot because they were considered assets, if you want to put it in a very cold fashion. But I think it's nice that they owned that a woman's sexual appetite can vary, that it doesn't have to be one size fits all. So again, here we are talking about representation. We are talking about women who have opted not to practice monogamy, basically. So again, here we're talking about those who choose a certain way of life and how it's acceptable for them to be true to their dharma. So that's the lovely thing here. They weren't judged here because it's just something they do. It's something that destiny has. I'm not going to bring in terms like destiny and fate because let's be practical about it. It's just that some women weren't cut out for the life of a chaste wife. And some women aren't cut out to be courtesans, to be apsaras. They aren't very comfortable with their sexuality. So it just changes like that. And it's all about making choices. And I think it's not about the choices themselves. It's about making the choice you have made work for you. So in that sense, Mohini and Menaka are very powerful women because they never apologized for the decisions they made. They made different choices and they stood by their choices. Mohini, in fact, there's a very beautiful lesser known story from the Mahabharata where we are talking about Aravan, who was Arjuna's son by Ullupi. And there's a version of the story which says that he was sacrificed on the eve of battle because he possessed certain auspicious marks. And he said he did not want to die unwed. He he said he wanted a wife who would mourn him. And as everyone knows, for a long time, widows were severely stigmatized in India. So this was not something which many women wanted. They knew that, they were staring widowhood in the face because he was going to die on the next day. Mohini very boldly stepped up and she said, I will be his wife. I will mourn for him. I will give him the love which he clearly needs. So, that was a very brilliant, bold move which she made. She was completely unapologetic about it. I think we women should learn from women like Mohini and Menaka. Hold your head high, make the choices which feel right to you, but also be sensible. I think women need to be smarter and more sensible when it comes to their choices because the stakes have always been high for women.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am. With this, we come to the end of our session. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Lavanya Vemsani, Dr. Jeffery D. Long, and Anuja Chandramouli, ma'am, for this remarkable session. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.